I'm Joe Radonovich. Listening to the Colonel Bogey March evokes memories of our early training days at Camp Gordon, Georgia in 1943 and 44. For those who might not recall all the names of the officers pictured, we had the privilege of serving under General George Patton, who commanded the 3rd Army in Europe, but also the 3rd Cavalry in the early 30s. The others are General Walton Walker, who is 20th Corps Commander, Colonel Frederick Drury, who is commanding officer of Group from Camp Gordon until his capture at Gravelotte, France in September of 1944. General James Polk, who assumed command of Group after Colonel Drury's capture, Colonel Marshall Wallach, commanding officer of the 3rd Squadron from Camp Gordon right through the campaign in Europe, Colonel Philip Davidson, who commanded the 43rd until the group arrived in Europe and he was appointed Group Executive Officer, Colonel Lester Cross took command then of the 43rd until he was captured, and finally Colonel Preston Utterback, who assumed command of the 43rd after Colonel Cross was captured. Many of our troopers can recall the start of reactivation of the 3rd Cavalry sometime around March 15, 1943 at Camp Gordon, Georgia, and the assignments to the various troops and barracks in our squadron compound. And then the changes, the reassigning and transferring to other troops. On May 19, we commemorated the anniversary of the founding of the 3rd Cavalry Mounted Rifles in 1848. The day at Camp Gordon was spent in parades, speeches, and dancing. Our 3rd Cavalry history goes back to the war with Mexico. The 3rd Cavalry were the first troops to enter Mexico City and planted the Stars and Stripes on Chapultepec Castle. We all know the famous words of General Winfield Scott when he saluted the 3rd Cavalry with the words, "Brave Rifles, veterans." From that time on, the 3rd was called upon to perform with great deeds in over 300 different battle actions. Among the heroes of the 3rd, we count 21 Congressional Medal of Honor winners. Former illustrious commanders of the 3rd Cavalry were the great General George S. Patton and General Joe Wainwright, two of the finest. We remember with fondness our other commanding officers, Colonel Marshall Wallach, adding to that our group commanders, Colonel Drury and General Polk. Those of us who wound up in the Bavarian Alps at the end of hostilities recall General Patton's visit on Organization Day, on May 19, 1945, and we sure remember the good news he gave us about going to the Pacific. Besides the rigorous training in Camp Gordon, a few of the men had extended hand-to-hand combat in some of the dives in Augusta. Tennessee maneuvers sort of prepared us for the weather we encountered in Europe. Training was finally over, and the squadron headed for Camp Shanks and the long wait before going overseas. That waiting period was monotonous, but broken every now and then with weekend passes to New York City. For many of us, it was the first glimpse of Manhattan, and each man has his own memory of days and nights in the big city. Finally, the orders came through, and we left New York Harbor on July 1st, meeting up with a huge convoy headed for Liverpool. The crossing took 2 weeks. Our squadron headed south and wound up on Salisbury Plain, where we again waited further orders. Here we discovered two things: warm British beer and English girls. The beer was warm and the girls were cold. At this time, the D-Day landings had already taken place. Beachheads had been established on the French coast, but the Allied advance had bogged down. The first assault units had penetrated the German lines, but were being held up by fierce enemy action. The Third Army was finally committed, and on August 6th, we moved down to the port of Southampton to cross the Channel. Elements of our squadron were finally ashore in Normandy. That was the 9th of August, and we were now on the move. We rode through large and small towns with odd names like Avranches, Coutances, Vitry. The devastation we witnessed was awesome. But everywhere were the French waving and cheering us, and the German army about 5 or 6 miles away, waiting. On August 11, 1944, the first enemy action was around a town called Mayenne. That skirmish delayed group's advance for a day or two. It made our troops realize that it's going to be tough. We continued our forward march through the famous racing town of Le Mans about the 14th of August. At that point, we were about 90 miles from Paris. Our orders were to maintain contact with the enemy and report all contacts, enemy strength, and so on to squadron and group. Our mission, as always, was to be the eyes, ears, and nose of the infantry and heavier armor coming up in our rear. We were the spearhead for 20th Corps and at times traveled too fast. August 16 and 17 saw us around Orleans, the birthplace of Joan of Arc. It was about this time that we loaded up hundreds of cases of champagne and cognac for later medicinal purposes. Some of it had to be appropriated for Thanksgiving and Christmas celebrations. The end of August saw the squadron headed toward Reims, the cathedral city where many French kings were crowned. The 30th of August saw us going through the Argonne forest to try to get to Verdun and important bridges over the Muir River. We encountered stiff enemy resistance from enemy units dug in on the opposite shore. Group was given the task of clearing roads leading into Verdun, so the infantry and armor assigned to that area could follow the path cleared by the 3rd and 43rd. Verdun was a key point in shutting down the escape of the Germans still in Normandy, and once Verdun was in danger of being taken by the Americans, the Germans concentrated on bombing the last bridge in Verdun without success. Once through Verdun, we stalled on a German airfield because of a shortage of gasoline. Only limited reconnaissance could take place after some stocks of gasoline were discovered on the airfield. At about that time, the squadron was making some excursions north and south and also east toward Luxembourg, going some 70 miles at one point through enemy lines. Some units got as far as the Moselle River, and then the incredible happened. The dash by a recon platoon of B Troop into Thionville. The headlong rush of that one platoon of the 3rd took the Germans in Thionville by surprise. And in spite of the overwhelming odds, that one platoon managed to kill and disable about 1,500 of the enemy and ruined over 100 of his vehicles. That action resulted in one fatality and several wounded, but every man was returned to the squadron. Bridges all along the Moselle were being destroyed by the enemy, and their artillery was massing on the east bank of the river. Our troops were now scouting behind enemy lines. On the 5th of September, a recon patrol with Colonel Drury accompanying it was ambushed near Gravelotte, France, near Metz. Colonel Drury and those men were never seen again. On September 14, Colonel Polk assumed command of group. Now squadron was stretched along the Moselle River, and after a 600-mile dash across France, we slowed down. The action along the river from Thionville southward was fierce, with the Germans trying to hold against the might of the Third Army. The main thrust of squadron was to try to clear the roads leading to Metz, but the forts ringing this old city were a severe hindrance to our troops, especially Fort Driant, in front of which we remained for weeks, contending with rain almost daily and the constant enemy and friendly artillery blasting away. About the middle of October, we reloaded our vehicles and left the woods in front of Driant, being relieved by an infantry division. We headed again toward Thionville and the area around it on the west bank of the Moselle, in such towns as Hayange, Ukange, and Knutange. Our mission then was to reconnoiter up and down the Moselle and try to determine enemy troop strength. That reconnaissance resulted in a number of skirmishes with the enemy, in which we managed not only to obliterate a goodly number of the enemy, but also took a few prisoners who gave us some very good information about their own units. We went into Luxembourg about the first week in November. On the 14th, the 3rd Cavalry crossed the Moselle and ran into more fierce action on the other side. We then found ourselves in the Sarre-Moselle Triangle, a landscape full of dragon's teeth, tank traps as far as the eye could see. On November 18, we crossed the German border, the first unit in the Third Army to do so. Action in the Sarre-Moselle Triangle continued through November and December, and the Battle of the Bulge forced a night march north on December 19. By this time, Fort Driant had fallen on December 7, due in great part by the heroic efforts of Task Force Polk. The last 2 or 3 weeks of December saw fierce action in almost every troop area. The cold days of December became the cold days of January, the new year of 1945. The entire area of the Moselle and Sarre was a continuous seesaw of action, taking important crossroads towns, then being driven out by superior numbers of enemy troops, then retaking again with armor and infantry units of 20th Corps. Heavy action during January and February took a huge toll of enemy troops, and the first 2 weeks of March saw some of the heaviest fighting by all the troops of the 3rd and some other units attached to us. Artillery barrages were constant in our area. On March 26, the 3rd headed toward the Rhine River, crossing at Mainz on the night of the 29th, and heading toward Frankfurt, Fulda, and Kassel to the northeast. In the marches through cities such as Kassel, Mulhausen, and Erfurt, we began to see evidence of forced labor and concentration camps. It was during mid-April that the roads became choked with thousands of prisoners. The Germans were surrendering by the thousands. The 3rd Cavalry turned again to the west, passing through Weimar, then south through Nuremberg and Regensburg, across the Danube, through Munich, and into the Bavarian Alps by the end of April. The late April rains didn't do much for cross-country travel, with many vehicles getting bogged down to the axle again. Some forward echelons ran into German horse-drawn artillery, which they promptly eliminated, then took off again after retreating infantry units. The first few days of May, the squadron was engaged in mopping up operations, having the last firefight in and around a city called Steyr. In those waning days of the battle, on May 4, one of the most singular and saddening actions of F Company and A Troop of the 3rd was the taking of the concentration camp at Ebensee. We know that as one of the most unforgettable events in the entire experience of the 3rd Cavalry in World War II. And for those survivors of that camp, it is also an unforgettable event. The European War finally ended on May 7, 1945. At that time, it didn't much matter to us what was going on in the rest of the world. We were glad of the peace and quiet that came with the end of hostile action. Traveling across France from the beaches, we covered some 648 miles in August. From September 1st to the end of February, some 270 miles. Over 1,400 miles in March and April. And from May 1st to the end of the war, approximately 285 miles. A total of almost 3,000 miles, none of it in a straight line. But every mile had a memory in it for one of us. That tortuous road had come to an end. A road filled with danger and death for both sides. For some of our buddies, the road ended before May 7th. For those of us who came home, let's remember those who didn't come back. On May 19, 1945, in a field in Austria, we had the honor and privilege of observing again our organizational day when we passed in review for General George S. Patton and his staff and heard him extol the heroic deeds of the 3rd Cavalry once more in the spirit of General Winfield Scott. Brave Rifles, veterans. Thank you very much.